This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's episode 308 of the Craft Beer Brewing podcast, and this is the second of our panel discussions recorded at the Brewers Retreat a few weeks ago at Russian River Brewing, and it's a concept and a conversation that is very much driven by the event location in Sonoma County, California. Of course, for those who know, one of California's preeminent wine regions. The idea for the panel came alongside the idea to make a special collaboration beer for event attendees, kind of like the collaboration we made for the last retreat in Maine, a blend of perennial Maman and WeldWorks Media Noche that we dubbed Mama Noche. With our location in wine country this year, a wine-beer hybrid collaboration, it just seemed like a beautiful way to reference both the location as well as the collaboration idea behind the event. So I pitched the idea to Vinnie and to Cory King of Side Project. We got moving on that project last September. To again take advantage of our location, we invited Nick Gislason of Hanabi Lager Company to join for a day of brewing at the retreat, as well as for this panel discussion. And although Nick doesn't make wine-beer hybrids, he knows a thing or two about wine from his work as a winemaker for one of the United States' most coveted wineries. And of course, through the course of this panel discussion, we tasted a few beers that you may be lucky enough to have in your own cellar, like Side Project's L'Homme Vidal Blanc and Russian River's small batch Pomace beer. Only those who were there and a few others will have the chance to try the collaboration beer due to the extremely small quantity produced. So you have to use your imaginations for that. But, as always, through the course of this conversation, we focus more on process and technique than sheer tasting notes. So there is plenty to learn from this in-depth conversation about brewing beers that use wine grapes, those kinds of intersections of fermentations and all of that. Before we jump into the conversation, for years, G&D Chillers has chilled the beers you love, partnering with 3,000 plus breweries across the country. They're proud of the cool partnerships they've built, offering 24/7 service and support. G&D builds with non-proprietary parts, expert craftsmanship, and constant innovation. G&D's in-house engineering crew have been piping breweries, wineries, and distilleries for over 30 years. They offer free piping design and consultation with the sale of every chiller they build. Reach out for a quote today at gdchillers.com or call to discuss your next project. Also, this episode is sponsored by BSG, exclusive distributors of Rahr Malting Company, producers of quality malt since 1847. Is your Pilsner looking flat, wishing you could show off a mousse-like foam stand, or looking to boost mouthfeel in a hazy? Then look no further, because Rahr Dextrin malt is here to improve your beer, bringing better body, improved haze formation, and stable foam. It's practically magic. Visit bsgcraftbrewing.com to learn how. Also, thanks to BSG for sponsoring our Brewers Retreat, the source of this very conversation that we are about to share with you. Also, scheduling freight carriers should be the last thing on a brewer's mind, so why not trust the experts to handle freight for your ingredients? Old Orchard has partnered with a leading logistics firm in the craft beverage industry to transport your flavored craft concentrate blends. When you order 2 pails or more from Old Orchard, you qualify for freight quotes. To get started, head on over to oldorchard.com/brewer. Now, on to our discussion on wine-beer hybrids. So this morning, we're going to kick off with a conversation about wine-beer hybrids. Obviously, Vinnie and Cory. Nick is joining us, Nick Gislason from Hanabi Lager. He does not brew wine-beer hybrids, but he does a little bit in the wine world. So we thought we'd have his perspective in talking about wine, grapes, terroir, and some of those other things, and that we couldn't miss the opportunity to get some of his perspective on this. Nick, why don't you kick things off and give us a little bit of background on you and your winemaking journey as well as your beer making journey.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jamie. So my journey into beer and wine. So I grew up in Northwest Washington, so a lot of breweries. Started to brew up in the town of Bellingham, Washington, at Boundary Bay Brewing Company, and worked up there for a few years, and then transitioned into wine because I grew up on a small family farm, and I was interested to have a hand in actually growing my raw materials and seeing it all the way from basically the field to the glass. And at the time, it seemed like wine would be an interesting way to get to do that, because it was relatively common, at least at that time, for winemakers to oversee both the farming and the winemaking. So made a transition into wine, moved to California, and that was 2007, and made wine here, made wine in New Zealand, came back, studied winemaking, and that's been most of what I've been doing since then. I've been at a company called Screaming Eagle since 2010, and coming from Harlan Estate before that and a few other places. But at Screaming Eagle, so the last 14 years, I've been managing both the farming and then also the winemaking. And so we have 50 little acres there, split up into about 50 different parcels. And so there's a variety of different soils, different hydrology going on, subsurface, and we have a bunch of different clonal material as well, different budwood selection. And so we farm these 50 different parcels to try to optimize everything in terms of what budwood we put on what soil, what rootstocks, and then the farming practices. We try to hone in how we manage cover crop, how we manage soil fertility, soil health, things like irrigation, and all these kinds of things are the farming knobs that we turn to try to queue up these 50 different parcels that bring unique things to the blend. So some parcels more for aromatics, others more for body and mouthfeel, and it's sort of an endless job to try to figure out what are the greatest strengths of these different plots, and then how to bring them together to make, in our case, 2 different red wine blends. So that's what I do. So
And then you created a brewery on the side just because you didn't have enough going on.
So there's a saying, it takes a lot of beer to make a little bit of good wine. And so that's certainly true around here as it is anywhere. Or also like the one in Germany, in Mosel, they say the best part of the wine tasting is the beer afterwards. I always thought that was kind of neat.
I've not heard that one. I'm going to start using that one.
I like that one a lot.
But how about the one that Napa's for auto parts, Sonoma's for wine?
Little Napa Sonoma rivalry here. Expect nothing less. Thank you, Vinnie.
Our friend Ron Capps races NHRA, and his sponsor is Napa. And we tell him every year, if you ever win at Sonoma Raceway at Sears Point, you got to say that on national television. That would be so rad. And the awesome thing is he's a huge beer drinker. So,
oh, that's fun.
Cool. So, I mean, let's, the framework of this is, since we're here in wine country in Sonoma and also have guests from Napa, more California wine, we're going to bring the 2 teams together here on this. Maybe we kick off with, just a broad general question. Why? You've got wine, you have beer. Vinnie, Cory, as you decided to make beer wine hybrid, that bring these 2 things together, what's the motivation behind it? And, what opportunity did you see in flavor and experience, that using wine grapes and beer afforded you?
There you go. Yeah. Cory King, Side Project. Thanks for having me. So in front of you, actually, you have a beer from us called Loam. And, if you will, the inspiration for me using wine grapes, my first love was wine. Actually, my wife and I met working fine dining, and I actually applied to be assistant winemaker right out of college. I didn't get the job, but as I got into making funky and sour beer, much inspired by the beers of Vinnie, honestly, at the time, different fruits and the different ways we could use fruit in all these different sour beers to try to find balance and just to kind of find a new complexity or a new fermentation profile was a lot of fun and awesome. But it was always interesting to me that the wine grape wasn't used that often. You can name a million raspberry beers or blueberry beers, but I can't name very many raspberry wines or blueberry wines. It's like the fruit that's meant for fermentation is grapes. And so being a wine lover, I quickly, grasped onto that. We also are fortunate that our brewery we're about 45 minutes away from the Augusta AVA. I'm sure none of you have heard of it. It's a wine region of Missouri. The wines aren't very good, but
they won't be listening to the Craft Beer and Brewing podcast.
But no, I mean, and they have. I will say, since we started buying grapes from Augusta 10 years ago, I mean, there is a little bit more attention to the details there, and it is a lot of fun. And some of the whites I do enjoy. While we're there, it's not like I'd grab them to have at dinner. But we have some great friends out there. They obviously love what we're doing. We love what they're doing. And so be able to work with, Missouri again, and something close, and getting grapes from these growers and these producers, and seeing what the wine tastes like, and then kind of seeing what our beer tastes like after the fact, has been really great. And that was what drove me to those things where hey, at the end of the day, like, we make funky beer in oak barrels, and we have a feeling of more of a winery than a brewery. And I love wine, and I want to use a local wine grape. And we have used actually grapes from California before as well for some of our blends. But as we've grown and moved forward, we are now focusing more on just the Missouri grown grapes. And this is a Vidal Blanc grape, which is a Seyval Blanc hybrid that can stand the weather. So if that makes sense on why we do that.
Nick, have you ever heard of that variety?
Vidal Blanc, oh yeah.
All right.
Yeah, you learn about it in school.
Yeah.
You don't taste it out here very often.
There you go.
Oh, very cool. That's excellent.
Vinnie, what drove you to start these?
Yeah, for me, it starts with my childhood. I grew up in a wine growing family in Southern California, Temecula. It's a little wine region down there. My parents planted the very first commercial vineyard in Temecula in 1968. So I kind of grew up in this whole thing making wine. And it was Petite Syrah, which will have a thread into the beer that we have on the table here, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So that was the beginning of it. And then when I started homebrewing, I was actually making beer with Petite Syrah grapes, but not funky beer. I was just doing like blonde ale and adding Petite Syrah to it and getting this like really heavy tannin structure. And when we started making funky beer, we didn't necessarily make, grape beers. But Natalie and I did have this beautiful, like 100-year-old Muscat Canali grapevine behind our house when we lived in Geyserville, which is one of the northern towns of Sonoma County. And I would make like 1 or 2 barrels of a Muscat Canali grape that was inspired by the Cantillon beer, which I can't remember which one that has Muscat.
Is that Vigneron?
Yes, yeah, thanks. So that was the beginning of it. And then we had this idea of pairing specific barrels with the grapes, kind of carrying on with a little bit like we do with, Temptation is only Chardonnay barrels, Supplication's only Pinot barrels, Consecration's only Cab barrels. So now we've started continuing to roll that, making a Merlot grape beer under our Intinction line, Sauvignon Blanc, and those are all Sauvignon Blanc barrels, Merlot barrels, so on and so forth. And it was just very natural. We're in the middle of wine country here. We have access to absolutely, some of the best grapes in the world in this area. And it just was a really natural progression from my childhood to now. And I think one of the cool things is that you have to start thinking about the tannin structure. That's a whole nother component that you don't think about when you're making these wild beers. Normally you're thinking about, bitterness and gravity and how much sugar you're going to have left for the Brett and the bacteria to work off of. But now you have this whole other layer of flavor. And I don't know what, Cory, maybe where your mind goes with that. But for me, that's one of the first things that I think about in making these funky grape beers. And then, it's definitely something that a winemaker would be thinking about.
Yeah, let's talk about tannins. And I think that's something we can tap into Nick's brain on too. How do you all think about tannins as a flavor and texture component
Yeah, well, it might be interesting. So, to understand with at least the raw material itself with grapes, there's so many things that affect that, right? Everything from certainly variety. So in general with wine grapes, you have white and red, broadly speaking, but then you get into, and both have tannin, by the way, lots, depending on the variety. And then after that, it depends on specifically which white variety or which red variety, and some just innately have a lot more than others. And the range is pretty wide. So just to give like a perspective, so say you have a really light vineyard of Pinot Noir in terms of tannin. So that might have anywhere between 10 and 20 times less tannin than, say, a Cabernet vineyard that might be just down the road somewhere. And so it's not like we're talking like a little bit, 20, 30% more or less, or 10%. It's like 10x or 20x, like broadly different contents of measurable tannin. And so within that, there's varietal differences, and then there's site differences. So you can take a single variety, a single clone even, of say Cabernet or Pinot or whatever, and grow those on 2 different soils within a 5-mile separation. And you might measure anywhere between, say, 2 to 4x difference in tannin, which is huge. But just depending on if it's on a more clay soil or a more rocky, more highly drained soil. And so that effect is huge. And then on top of that would be the cultural practices of things like irrigation. If you farm those grapes really dry, let's say, broadly speaking, not a lot of water, you run pretty lean, you could have easily 2 to 3x more tannin than if you were irrigating those grapes a lot more frequently. So there's a lot of things that affect what you would have coming in the door. And then from there is all the processing decisions, right? So once you've gotten it through those farming choices and you say, okay, now we pick it. And I guess that's in and of itself another decision that affects the tannin quite a bit. But then you have it in, and then it's all about extraction. And so in the wine context, that's skin contact time is one. So you make a choice, and the skin contact time, when you crush the grapes, and you either separate them as juice or you actually ferment on the skins. And when you separate the skins, that's when the tannin extraction stops. And so that's a very conscious choice that you need to make. And that could be anywhere between 10 minutes after you crush it to 2 months after you crush it. So you can understand that really affects the outcome very strongly. And so that would be probably the main processing decision, how much time you spend on the fruit, on the skins. But then also things like temperature play into that. And then how aggressively you might move the contents of the tank. So like in the case of a red wine fermentation, how much you're pumping over. So take the juice from the bottom and spray it over the top of the cap of floating grape skins. And so there's a lot of things that you can do then on the processing to help steer it. But sort of at the end of the day, it's about thinking about the things that you can change and those that you can't, and then adjust the things that you can change to sort of compensate for the things that you can't, if you see what I mean. To try to find something with nice balance and something that brings pleasure at the end of the day.
Sure. Cory, in practice, how does that start to look for you? And obviously, there's going to be different practice for different wines and intentions. You use both red and white grapes, different kinds of bases, different goals for acidity and funkiness and all these. But where do you start then in that creative process, thinking about envisioning, beers that are going to use grapes?
So I think the beer you have in front of you, I think this is like maybe the 10th or so grape beer we've done. And as of about 3 years ago, we had our license changed so we could actually make wine as well. So pre that, I had to use fruit as an addition to beer. I couldn't quite make wine. So now we can do separate fermentations, if you will, with the grapes and different processes, how long we're letting them sit on the skins legally. We can actually legally do that now. So for like this beer, we actually let the Vidal Blanc grapes, we left them on their skin after the crush. We inoculated with our Saison yeast and our bugs and left that tank in our barrel room to have a primary fermentation, if you will. So I left it on the skins, even though it was white wine, for about 7 days, just to get a primary fermentation out of that. And that wasn't an intent because as we talk about tannins, in the brewing industry, tannins are usually negative. They're coming from the husk and there's things that we don't want. But for wine drinkers and for winemaking processes, and I do not know how to make wine like anybody, but I'm just playing with fermentation as I always have and trying to create flavors that I never have before and then using it as a blending component. So by allowing it like this year to actually make wine, sit on the skins for about a week and then rack it off and then back blend with a higher acid Saison of ours that has an oak content and then letting those two things sit in oak again, blended for almost another fermentation was just a new way for me to play with the flavors that I've created to try to always find the best blend. And these are the model of our whole brewery is always finding blends. And I'm not putting all of this beer fermented on the skins is going to be perfect. So I'm always pulling out, trying to create flavors that we can then thus use for blends. And so I really like the softness that this beer still has, even fermented on skins. And then actually after we racked off the skins, we use those skins as a pumice beer, as a secondary, like almost orange wine process for a 2% table saison. And the tannins you get out of that beer are way higher than the tannins you get out of this beer. But it's cool because it's a flavor component that I haven't had in beer properly before. And so we're always just looking for the components.
Did you get to pick when the grapes were picked, or is it you're just at the
No, they
whim?
call me.
That was going to be my comment. Was you as a brewer, you almost never get to ask when your grapes are going to be picked because we're secondary to the winery. Typically, I've only had the opportunity, I think, once to ask I want it lower, bricks, which would give me a higher acid or whatever. So we are usually at the whim of the winery. The beer that we're serving tonight with the dinner, the small batch Intinction Sauvignon Blanc, this dry hop of Nelson, that was actually a much lower sugar content than they would have normally picked it at because there was a huge storm coming in and they wanted to get all the grapes off the vine. So in that case, it actually worked out because I did want it at a lower bricks.
We'll be back in a second with more of the panel, but first, take your brewing to the next level with AccuBrew's revolutionary fermentation monitoring system, now predicting specific gravity. AccuBrew's mobile app and stainless steel sensor work together to send you live data from inside your tanks, including predicted gravity, fermentation activity, clarity, and temperature. Unlike other fermentation monitoring systems, AccuBrew is CIP ready and designed to stay out of your way, saving you time and space. Their set-it-and-forget-it solution streamlines systems and processes, helps maintain consistency, and detect problems before they ruin a batch. Join the AccuBrew community today and enjoy 24/7 peace of mind. Also, brewing is currently one of the most innovative, adaptive, and fast-paced industries in the world. With consumer demand shifting to the latest and greatest trend, it can be difficult for production teams to keep up with the requirements. The ProFill series of rotary can fillers from ProBrew are accelerating plant production everywhere. These can fillers run at speeds between 100 and 600 plus cans per minute while achieving precise and consistent filling volumes not achievable by most inline and mobile fillers. For more information, visit www.probrew.com or email contact@probrew.com to learn exactly how they can take your operations to the next level. ProBrew, brew your beer. And did you know your water can change the flavor profile of your beer? Water is the #1 ingredient, after all, and USWaterSystems.com knows just how to treat it. USWaterSystems.com has been at the forefront of the craft brewing industry and created American-made water treatment systems with brewers in mind. Whether you're a hobbyist or a pro, head on over to USWaterSystems.com to learn more, because great beer starts here. Now, back to the panel. What's your creative process like on this, Vinnie, as you envision a beer like Intinction? And we've talked about this before, but in this context, how do you start thinking about the flavors, the wine grape, sugar, and the base beer that's going to help bring that forward?
I think about the acid content of what I think the base beer is going to be, and because I think that plays a lot into it. So I think about, and I'm typically of the mindset that if we're going to have a really big tannin structure, then we pretty much want to be thinking about maybe a little bit softer of a beer. It could go the other way, but for me, that's just our stylistic way of making these beers. The small batch pumice beer that is the red colored beer in front of you that looks more like a wine, that is 100% Sinambic, which is our spontaneous fermented beer. So when we were all on the tour yesterday, looked at the cool ship, so stuff from that program. So I went through and picked wine barrels that were really soft and low in acidity, maybe a little more funky because it was a little bit younger, hadn't developed all the acid yet, but the focus was a really clean beer with lower acidity, knowing that Petit Syrah, that's the grape that went into this, that's a pretty highly tannic wine grape. And the unique thing about this beer is that it's pumice, and Cory just mentioned pumice. Oddly, people think of pumice as red, but there is white
For sure.
and red pumice. So pumice is just a generic wine term for the pressed grapes. So it could be white or red, fermented already on the skins, which the reds would be usually not the whites, but it could be the whites. And then you've got this beautiful dried, cake of dried grapes. And so we took that and aged it on the Sinambic beer, or the Sinambic beer on the pumice at 6 pounds of pumice per gallon of beer. I get the pumice for free though, so it's like reuse. And this pumice came from a little winery here in the Russian River Valley. Long time grape growing family, Italian family by the name of Bacigalupe. And I don't know if you're familiar.
I am.
Yeah, and really amazing family, multi-generation grape growing family that makes Petit Syrah, and even easier is it's made at the custom crush facility right behind here. So we just drive our forklift and grab the bins. It makes it so easy. We can also get any grapes processed at Grand Cru. We're lucky we have Dumal right behind us. It makes beautiful wines. We can get barrels and whatnot from. But this beer, the whole idea on the pumice beer was to really blur the lines between what wine and beer could be, which kind of goes back to the question. And in this case, I think it's different for every beer. And this one, it was truly, let's see where we can make a beer, purposefully not carbonate it. And so it has the very much of a wine quality to it. It's certainly, not going to pass as a Petit Syrah or even a Cabernet now, but it still has a pretty strong tannin structure and mouthfeel because Petit Syrah in and of itself is such a big grape and a big wine.
Let's talk about some of those methods. You mentioned pumice. Cory mentions, fermenting out, wines separately and then blending back with beer. Contact time. What methods do you find, and how do those change? Those methods for adding grapes in the beer change depending on whatever those factors are, white versus red, acidity goals, tannin structure and whatnot. What do you find, or what do you tend to lean towards in terms of methods for pulling these things together?
I have one thing that came to mind that I would like to get Nick's comment on. When we're making these pumice beers, and I know Matt, his team, they made them at Firestone as well, and I know of a lot of breweries that have. One of the things you have to think about, and I didn't think about it, and I should have, coming from a winemaking background, but is how tight the winery presses the grapes. Because we've done multiple pumice beers with, let's say, Petit Syrah from one winery and Cabernet Sauvignon from another, put the same amount of beer on the same amount of pumice at 6 pounds per gallon, and on the back end got like 25% less out because one of the grapes were pressed more, and it really just almost absorbed some of the, I don't know if you've experienced that.
Our pumice we use it's just the grapes have been broken up and we've fermented on the skins, and then we reuse the skins ourselves. So I've never just bought pumice and had pressed pumice.
How does a winery think about how they press how tight you press? I mean, I know you have first runnings.
Right. Yeah, it depends a lot. So what your intentions are with that press wine. So in the winemaking process, you have what's called the free run. So in the case of a red fermentation, you're tasting that ferment every day, and it's on skins. So the skins are floating on top of the wine, which is at the bottom of the fermenter. You're pumping that wine over the top. Like, think of the old percolator coffee makers where the water comes up the middle and then sprinkles down through the coffee grinds. So you're more or less doing that at tank scale with grapes to make red wine. And you're tasting every day or maybe multiple times every day, because each time you do that pump over process, you're pulling out more color, more tannin, to some extent more like bodybuilding polysaccharides, things that bring roundness and texture in the mid palate. That's all coming out every time you do a pump over. And then it's about trying to find that time to press where those things are in harmony. And if you go too far, you might end up with a wine that's too tannic, for instance, or maybe actually too sweet, too round, to to tip the wine out of a nice balance point. So you find that moment and say, okay, now we press, and then so you drain off the free run and then shovel out all that pumice and press it. And so it depends a lot on how long has that fermentation been on skins already? Has it been a week? Has it been 2 months? And then what's the nature of those grapes? Are they incredibly tannic? And are you like careful to just creep up to that point where you have enough tannin and then, okay, please cut it now before it goes way over. And so the press wine, it can range from sometimes really not very tannic at all to sometimes super tannic and bordering on bitter and not very pleasant. And so by that same token, the leftover pumice would have similar characteristics. So it could either be extremely tannic or maybe actually act like a fining agent for tannin. And there's some pumice that does that. And we use that in the winemaking process sometimes as like a natural fining agent to actually pull things out of some other wine. So pumice, it's certainly a complex material, and it depends on what the grapes were like that you started with, and then what your processing was like during the winemaking. That's going to determine what you end up with. And so, sometimes you might press it more dry, or not as dry. Other things affect it, like if you crush the fruit or not. So like a whole berry Pinot fermentation, where you destem the fruit, but you don't actually send it through a crusher. So you have a lot of these whole berries with a lot of entrained juice that even after pressing, you don't get very much of it out. And so, the amount of leftover juice can vary a lot.
We've found that in beer, it's usually that you're going to end up with something that's potentially too light, but not too much tannin. So we've used Pinot pumice before, and the beer never made it to market. It just got blended away.
You need some Napa Cabernet, my friend.
I knew he was going to get that.
Some real wine.
Yeah. Not this Alexander Valley stuff.
Not this weedy rubbish.
Yeah. Hey, if you guys can finish your blonde beer, we have, or the other one, whichever you want, we have a surprise beer that Natalie and team is going to pour. And we'll reveal that here in a minute.
Yeah, let's kick in that question though. How do you select grapes when you're thinking about what to add? What are there grapes that you really find? Obviously, Pinot Noir is not going to work for you. Are there some that you find that you lean on, and why?
For me, I always start with grapes that I actually would want to drink. Like I said, we don't have the variety or selection that you can get in California by any means, but when we're going to these winemakers and enjoying some of their wines, for me, I'd rather put one of the grapes that I enjoy into a beer. It's really no more or less than that, because once again, I'm always trying to build a beer from creating pieces. I'm not out in the vineyard going, I want this lot, I want this picked at this point. We don't really have those choices for us, at least in Missouri. And so what I'm just looking for is, this is a grape that I have a relationship with, because I can have their wine produced from that grape, and I enjoy it. So I'd like to, get that grape when you guys are picking, when you're pulling from the vine for your next harvest. If I have an opportunity to buy some from them, that allows me to, play with it and figure out what I can do with it. It's no more or less than that, really, for us.
So it has nothing to do with sugar content or any of these other kind of performance factors?
We don't get that choice. You know what I mean? Really,
fair.
it's more varietal based. And so I always try to do a white and a red every year. We've done Vidal Blanc in previous years, and it's been one of my favorite wine hybrid beers we've ever done. This year we also did a Norton version of Loam. So Norton is another Missouri grape. It's really musty, funky. It's not very delicate by any means, but it does lend itself well for funky beer. It really does. I enjoy that grape more in funky beer than I do by itself, just because our grapes are a little rough around the edges.
I had to look up Norton in the Oxford Wine Companion when you told me what you were.
But I enjoy, I really, really enjoy Norton, our funky beers. It's kind of brash, and it can hold up to a lot, and it allows us a lot of freedom to play with, where I wouldn't overpower it too quickly, because on some levels, sometimes our beers are more powerful than some of the wines. And you lose a little bit of the nuance and delicacy of what they are. We just play around every year and create puzzle pieces to figure out what we're going to blend.
I was just going to pick one beer that to talk about to relate to Jamie's question. That is Intinction Sauvignon Blanc, which is on tap right now for this Brewers Retreat. The cool thing there is that there's actually no bacteria in that beer. And the thought was that we get these Sauvignon Blanc grapes, and they've got a pretty high acidity. And so we're going to use the acidity in the grapes and not acidity from bacteria. And then we're selecting a couple of Brettanomyces strains from a microbiologist friend of ours over in Napa at ETS Labs, which is a wine lab. But they have this amazing array of Brett. Most of it's horrible strains of Brett, but there's a few that are high in 4-ethyl guaiacol. And when we're looking at Brett, we're looking at 4-ethyl guaiacol and 4-ethyl phenol, and we want the high 4-ethyl guaiacol. It gives you more spicy and jasmine notes and whatnot. So we're using multiple strains of Brett, really soft strains of Brett, Sauvignon Blanc, high acidity. So in that case, like that's the one that's my go-to grape beer year after year. So, yeah.
More from the panel in a minute, but first, hear that? That's the sound of your beer out in the world. Hanging out at parties, going on adventures, meeting new people. It's carbonated to perfection and the can art looks slick. Twin Monkeys Beverage Systems knows how to capture quality in a can. Their custom-built canning lines combine high quality with affordability so that people can get a taste of your tap room from any room. Visit twinmonkeys.net today and learn just how easy it is to get your craft into cans. Also discover a whole soft lager range by Fermentis covering traditional to modern style lagers. Soft Lager S189 for elegant lagers with floral notes, Soft Lager S23 for fruity and hoppy ones, and Soft Lager W3470 for your neutral beers. Available in 500 gram, 100 gram, and 11.5 gram formats. And ABS Commercial has been a full-service brewery outfitter for over 10 years. They're proud to offer brew houses, tanks, keg washers, and small parts to brewers across the country, as well as equipment for distilling, cider making, wine making, and more. They know the ins and outs of the brewing and installation process and can design the perfect setup for you, whether you're just starting out or looking to expand. Contact them today at sales@abs-commercial.com to discuss your customized brewery needs. ABS Commercial, we are brewers. Now, back to the panel. Cool. Well, do you want to talk about what everyone has just been poured?
Yeah, so maybe if possible, I don't know if did they leave the bottle? Yeah, they left the bottle on the table. So a little surprise for everyone. When we were planning this, Jamie reaches out and says, what do you think about a blend, the collaboration between Side Project and Russian River? And we've been longtime friends. Natalie and I met Cory at this beer festival called Boulevardia, and I think we were walking back to the hotel kind of in a group or some setting, and Steve Dressler, retired brewmaster, whatever his title was at Sierra, was with us, and we ended up all having drinks that night, gin and tonics or whatever, and we've been friends since. And so this was a really cool idea that Jamie had, and so we're blending two grape beers together. Why don't you start talking? You talked a little bit about the Norton beer, but
yeah. So our component for this, when Vinnie, thank you very much. This is the first time I've actually tasted this beer. I got to taste our piece that was sent over. So at the same time, or not the exact same time, but from the same winery called Noble Ice in Augusta, Missouri, we got Norton grapes from them. Which Norton grape is the Missouri State grape. So a lot of the wineries like to grow Norton. Our climate's a lot harsher than it is here. It's wet. It's hot. It does not get these cool nights. So these grapes have to be real thick-skinned, real hardy, and that's where it brings me to that. They're brash and a little harsh around the edges, but that lends itself very well. We've used Norton quite a few times, very well as a component for in structure for our funky beer. So this Norton I got in, we did the same process for both of our wine grape beers last year, where We brought it in. We had put it in our barrel room, which is our cooler, a cooler room in tank. Being a brewer, I try to keep O2 out of it the entire time. I know, like, we didn't do any punch downs or pump overs or anything. I inoculated with, at the time, what our best tasting foeder is. We pulled about a half barrel off the bottom and pumped it into these grapes. They were already pretty much getting ready to ferment by themselves, which they would have, but I also like to kind of get our side project culture in there and kind of give it a chance, because when this is done fermenting, they're negative Play-Doh. I believe I sent this to you after I blended in some beer as well. So I believe I pulled some beer off. So we moved this after it was fermented in stainless. We moved it to oak. And so we moved to one of our oak foeders and back blended with Saison for a preliminary blend. And then let that kind of, that harmony defined itself, also let it ferment pretty much again, because the bugs in the wine usually are so aggressive, they take all of our Saisons down to even below 0. So we almost have to let them ferment a whole nother time once we move them together and let it rest. And when that happened, I pulled off some of the still beer, if you will, and this had been moved from the skins by then to send out to Vinnie. And I sent Vinnie out a couple bottles of just still beer for him to look at, play with, and try to find, a purpose for them is for this blend. And it's I love it. It's really nice.
Sorry, I forgot to send you a sample.
No, it's okay. I am okay.
The element of surprise.
It is.
So the beer that we contributed to this was Intinction Syrah. It's actually a batch that we've never released before. I just have it now in kegs. It was poured once, I believe, at Garrison, our head brewer, who was our helper yesterday, poured it at the Weldworks Festival last year, if I remember correctly. But we've just kind of been hanging on to it and waiting for a reason and a purpose and a time to use it, and this was it. So the Syrah grapes came from our neighbors at Dumal. I went over and picked up the grapes. This was a pretty small amount, so we have a small crusher destemmer. I managed that myself. We used some foeder beer, which we call, it's an orphan beer, as we call it. It's just basically a blonde base 5.5% alcohol beer that doesn't really have a home, but oftentimes we use it for fruit beers. So we added fruit at about 3 pounds per gallon of beer, and then let it sit for probably 6 to 8 weeks. So a decent amount of time, longer than most wineries would let their grapes sit, through a fermentation with skin contact, and then eventually, racked it off, separated it, gave it some time to settle, and then we've just been kind of hanging on to it. The beer was a couple years old already, so it's got some good age on it. When Cory sent me the beer, his beer, I did a bunch of different lab bench top trial blends, and in the end, the 50-50 worked out good. It wasn't that I wanted to be Switzerland or anything.
I wouldn't have minded one bit. I wouldn't have minded one bit.
But no, it just happened to be what worked best. Was just an even split blend, and kind of in true collaboration form. It wasn't just Cory and I. The label was done by Jamie. So Craft Beer and Brewing had a hand in this as well. So the other cool part is we did bottle enough to give all of the attendees 2 bottles to take home. So I hope none of you are carry-on only. So tonight we'll put a table to the right of the exit going out, and as you guys are leaving, our warehouse team already has them in bags. You can just grab a 2-pack, and it'll be on the honor system to just grab one, and you guys can enjoy it down the line. So,
Very cool.
Do you have any questions from anybody for the panel?
What about TTB in relation to these blends?
Oh, the fun parts.
You just not even mentioned.
yeah, the TTB is a big part of this, and pumice beer is a questionable, just as an example. For grapes, you're fine, but you cannot just say Sauvignon Blanc. You have to say Sauvignon Blanc grapes or Cabernet Sauvignon grapes, that sort of thing. Pumice is a gray area that I'm actually working on right now to try to make it not gray. We've had multiple conversations about this week already, and I've had conversations recently with other brewers also. My thinking is that when you make a spirits barrel-aged beer, even when you rinse the barrel, in fact, Cory and I were talking the other 2 days ago, and he laughed when I told him the TTB's response that said, oh, well, you got to rinse all that spirits out. And Cory laughed because he's like, even when you rinse, it's impregnated in the wood. It's in the wood. So
nobody rinses their barrels.
So, but that's the basis of it, that yes, there is a TTB component. When it's just grapes, it's actually not a problem. It's just another fruit in that sense. So we've used natural lees that wasn't fermented yet from a local winery from Flowers, a pretty high-end Pinot Noir producer that made this really beautiful mixed fermentation Saison type beer. So that's just another angle of using a local wine product that's not necessarily grapes directly. It's more of an indirect use of it. That one too, I bottle conditioned with a native Sonoma County yeast called Rock Pile that Nick's probably and Cory and I we've used it. Yeah, and it's an appellation up above Dry Creek Valley, and that yeast has been isolated, so you can actually buy a dried version of the Rock Pile yeast, which is really cool. So in that case, that beer we blended with some of our Sonambic, and that was 3 different basically yeast sources of Sonoma County all into one beer. Now
I have a question for you two guys, because as someone who's never made a grape beer hybrid myself, do you think about it in terms of, are you looking for harmony between, okay, what are the grapes going to bring, and then what is the grain going to contribute, the specific grain selection, and then the hops and the yeast? Are you thinking about it in the different components like that, and thinking, okay, I'm going to get acidity from here, I'm going to get savory from here, going to get herbal from here? Or am I thinking about that like not in the right way? How do you compose beers like this? How do you put together pieces of the puzzle?
Yeah, my answer, it's kind of repetitive, where we're like, so our brewery is very different than most. We have a ton of barrel stock, a lot of foeders. We don't really have a lot of brands we repeat. So I get to walk into our brewery whenever there's something new's coming out, and it's just a blank slate of pieces, if that makes sense. Like we have, if you go into our barrel room and there's 400 barrels, there's probably 50 different beers we've brewed, and each barrel has its own personality, and so we're always just finding the best blend. Everything we do is a blend. The foeders offer a lot of volume to help us with blends. So I've only fermented grapes a couple times in my life now. You know what I mean? I'm not maybe I don't even know if I'm that good at it, but I think I'm pretty good at blending. And finding which direction those flavors we've created go. So I don't structure it beforehand, if that makes sense. I'm just brewing and or fermenting, moving to oak, and then we'll revisit when the time is right to start back blending and figuring out which direction we go. So now when we do the blends, it is that. Like, all right, this is our acid component. All right, obviously the grapes are gonna add things that we can't get on beer, which is really cool for us. It's a component that I don't get to play with a lot, that to have those different acids, to have those tannins, to have something that, even though the pH is low, but the TA is pretty high. I mean, it's actually TA is pretty low, so it's not really actually that acidic. Is a different component that we don't see very often with our beers, and so it just becomes puzzle pieces. Is all it really is.
And is it the same for you, Vinnie, in terms of?
It is for grape beers, because we're going to our barrel cellar, doing the same thing Cory said, and go, yeah, we're just going to find the right component. It's almost like when I talked about the pumice beer, finding something that was a little bit less acidic. A little milder, softer. But oddly, when we made the idea behind Temptation, Supplication, and Consecration, our 3 main funky wild beers, those are like built around, like I was specifically thinking with Consecration's a great example, dark beer, so dark like chocolate malts, that sort of thing, thinking about contributions from Cabernet Sauvignon. I knew specifically the barrels were going to come from our friends at Silver Oak, American Oak, not French Oak, as Nick knows and any of the wine folks in the room know. Totally different oak contribution. And I always tell the story, one time I made consecration with some French oak barrels, Cabernet French oak barrels, and the beer tasted totally different. It didn't even taste like consecration. We ended up just blending it all away, and there it went. So even the barrel type contributed in that case. But when we're doing grape beers, I think the exact same way Cory does. We're going to our cellar, picking the best blend, or making the best blend, and then going forward. And in some cases, it just doesn't work. Like the Pinot Noir, we did 100% carbonic maceration Pinot Noir beer. Carbonic maceration is a whole cluster fermentation on the stem still. And it just made this really light, it was an okay beer. We actually bottled it. It's still in bottles in the back, just waiting to see if maybe it comes around one of these days.
Like today?
But I just want to throw one other thing. We're probably up against the clock. Is that the types of Brettanomyces you use, whether it's wild or whether you choose it. I think we have the R&D Brett IPA on tap this week. That's a beer where the Brett strain is Brettanomyces anomalies, and all that pineapple and tropical that you get in that beer, that's all the Brett. That's very little from the hops. And so there we actually applied a wild, funky ingredient in the Brett on an IPA, on a very modern, an American style, modern IPA right now. So.
I did have one more question, then maybe we'll just finish it off with this one. Let's talk about finishing and carbonation on wine beer hybrids. That was a conversation that you all had in thinking about how to finish this blend. Obviously, you've had a mostly still beer. We've had a carbonated wine beer. Like, we've had some spectrum on this, and the collaboration itself is pretty low carbonated. It is carbonated. Talk about finishing and how carbonation impacts the flavor and perception of these.
Yeah. For the whites, I mean, we always carbonate our whites pretty high. It goes hand in hand with the sparkling white wines. We've always gone that way with the whites. And the reds have been a discussion, and that's something we've played with over the years. I actually early on bottled one pretty much still. We try to get just a tiny touch of carbonation there just to protect the beer part of it. I mean, O2 still scares the crap out of me, and we don't have stabilizers in our beers that a lot of wineries can put in their wine to help stabilize. So we barely carb some reds. Now earlier on, years ago, we've played around with still beer for a long time, but when those bottles left our facility and would get out in the public, we would get people email back say, "Well, this bottle's flat." And it's like, well, there's and that's okay, because there's a perception too of beer, and we're crossing over and doing a lot of different things here, and so I got that. Now we've also done some that were carbonated, more highly carbonated. I didn't prefer them as much for our red grapes, just because sometimes they just lost. They became almost like this sparkling Lambrusco-like, and I was like, there's nothing about it that it missed some pieces by carbonating that high. So I definitely look at the structure of the beer on a case-by-case basis, but overall, as a generalization, more of our reds I like very low carb. Or we did do one this year that turned out really well with the Loam Norton version, where we blended a bunch of Saison into it, and it became more of a Saison with Norton grapes as opposed to a wine beer hybrid. And when it was a Saison with Norton grapes, we can carb that higher, and it doesn't have the structure that a wine beer hybrid does. It has more of a beer structure to it. So I do watch as a crossing over point for those.
Yeah, we're the exact same thing. Blonde beers, higher carbonated, sparkling wine, champagne-like, red grape beers, lower. What I would like to explore moving forward is maybe a grape hybrid, like more in the rosé lane. That's like a summer that's spritzy and has that really fresh, vibrant, almost thirst quenching kind of quality to it, with just little tannin structure, light acidity, and some carbonation. So that's kind of somewhere I want to go in the future.
Cool. Well, thank you all. Vinnie,
Thanks,
Nick,
Jamie.
Cory. Cheers. Appreciate your thoughts on wine beer hybrids. Thanks for listening in on this panel on brewing wine beer hybrids. We have one more Brewers Retreat panel on West Coast IPA featuring Matt Brindleton, Ben Edmonds, and Sean Lawson coming up next week. But in the meantime, G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, and reliability with 24/7 service and support. Raw dextrin malt is here to improve your beer with better body, improved taste formation, and stable foam. Try Old Orchard's flavored craft juice concentrate blends in your next craft beverage. The AccuBrew system is designed to give you unprecedented insight into the fermentation process. ProBrew's rotary can fillers achieve precise and consistent filling volumes. USWaterSystems.com builds American-made water treatment systems with brewers in mind. Twin Monkeys offers customizable packaging solutions for every craft. The Soft Lager range from Fermentis covers all your lager needs, and ABS Commercial is your full-service brewery outfitter. Of course, if you've enjoyed this episode and any others, please subscribe. It's your subscriptions that help make it possible for us to bring you this podcast every week, and we sure would appreciate your support. Like I said last episode, we have no immediate plans for another Brewers Retreat, but if you want to be the first to know about future retreats, go to beerandbrewing.com, sign up for the email newsletter. It's free. We share great information out there every week with everyone on that newsletter list, and it's the best place to stay in tune with what we have coming up. We'll be back next week with another one. Cheers. This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.